You are listening to End of Life University podcast, real talk about life and death. This is episode number 134. Welcome to End of Life University podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt, hospice physician, author, and educator. In this podcast, I share thoughtful conversations with experts in various fields related to dying and death, and informative teaching sessions on preparing for the end of life by living fully today. Thank you so much for joining me today for another episode. In just a few moments, I'm going to be sharing with you a conversation with my friend, Reverend Terri Daniel, and we'll be talking about the hidden grief of life's transitions. Terri often talks about grief. I've interviewed her before about grief and bereavement following a death, but in this conversation, we're going to expand our look at grief and talk about the grief that occurs throughout life in other situations of life. So that's coming up in just a minute. Before that interview gets started, I have just a few announcements. I'll let you know that the year-long reading group, A Year of Reading Dangerously, is still taking place. For 2018, we're reading a new book every month on death and dying, which has been really fun so far. For the month of March, we're reading Knocking on Heaven's Door by Katie Butler. And at the end of the month, we will have live discussions by conference call with participants who want to show up and talk about the book over the phone, and that'll be happening at the end of March, and Katie Butler will be joining us for that call. So it's never too late to join. If you're interested, you can just go to eoluniversity.com/year of reading, and that'll take you to a page where you can view all the books we're reading for 2018. You can listen to the recorded discussions we've had of the books that we've already completed, and you can sign up if you want to be on the mailing list. If you're on the list, you'll get an email each month reminding you about the book that we're reading and telling you how to get access to it, also with a reader's discussion guide for the book that you can download if you want to use that to help you navigate the book as you're reading. So far, it's just been a lot of fun, and we're all really learning a lot. The books we're reading, they're not always easy, and so unlike book clubs where we might be reading books just for pleasure, these are books we're reading to educate ourselves, but also to explode some of our taboos and to broaden our knowledge and our acceptance of death and dying. So the books themselves are a bit of a challenge, some of them, to us, but I think that it's a really positive experience to learn new things and to see the end of life in a new way. So I hope you'll consider signing up for A Year of Reading Dangerously. And then also, we're right in the middle of the work group for teachers of death and dying classes that I'm conducting during the month of March, and I'm really excited about it. It's going really well so far, and so hopefully we will be inspiring some new teachers to start their own classes on various topics related to death and dying, and I'll be reporting back on that as we go along and as I get feedback. Then finally, if you're a regular listener, you know that this podcast is supported through generous donations made through my page at Patreon, patreon.com/EOLU. And these contributions help defray some of the expenses of creating, producing, and broadcasting this podcast and the End of Life University interview series. And so in addition, when you make a pledge of even $1 per month, it lets me know that you enjoy and benefit from this work I'm doing. And that emotional and spiritual support helps keep me going week after week. So I'm really grateful to all of you who have been making contributions over the past year. And particularly, I'll mention again my top donor over the last year and a half really now has been Suzanne O'Brien Rn. She is the creator of the Doula Givers program, and she offers trainings to people to become death doulas, but also other sorts of training in the community. And there are several different training courses you can access online at no cost, the introductory level of training. And so go to doulagivers.com and you'll learn more about Suzanne's work. And again, thank you, Suzanne, and thank you to all of the other donors who've been supporting this podcast for the last year. I'm so grateful for it. When you sign up, you'll get access to a monthly Q&A call that I've named the Hospice Happy Hour, where you can listen to my answers to questions that you all submit to me to answer about various aspects of the end of life. Always interesting to see the questions that come my way. So you receive that once a month when you're a donor, and for donors at the platinum level, get unlimited access to the replays of all the interviews from 2018 End of Life University as well. And there will be little surprises from time to time available also. So thank you. Once again, if you're interested, you can go to patreon.com/EOLU. And my extreme gratitude to everyone who has done that and offered to be a supporter. Thank you so much. So without further ado, we'll move on to the feature presentation for today, my conversation with Terri Daniel. And if you stay through the whole interview, at the very end, I'll be back just to sum up our talk with some of my favorite take-home points from our discussion. So enjoy the conversation, and I'll be back shortly when the conversation's over with. Hello and welcome to End of Life University. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt, and today I'm really excited to welcome my guest, my friend, Reverend Terri Daniel. Terri and I have done a number of interviews in the past, so I'm really excited to welcome her back today. We have talked quite a bit about grief in the past, and today we're going to expand that discussion into a broader area and talk more about what I think of as the hidden grief of life transitions. And so before we get started on that topic, I'll just tell you a little bit more about Terri. She is a clinical chaplain and end-of-life educator, certified in death, dying, and bereavement by the Association of Death Education and Counseling. Her work focuses on assisting dying and grieving individuals to discover a more spiritually spacious understanding of loss and trauma. And although many of us in the field are familiar with theories and practices related to grieving the death of a loved one, today we're going to talk about the other types of losses that we experience when our lives are in transition. And so having had the privilege of doing a grief workshop with Terri, which she does workshops all over the country, I'm really impressed with Terri's grasp and understanding of the grief process, and really excited that today we get to look at grief in the rest of our lives, other than in situations where death has occurred. So Terri, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, my dear. It's always so nice to be on your show.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about this subject, and I called it kind of the hidden grief because I think sometimes, especially those of us who work in the end-of-life arena, we're so focused on death and dying and the grief and bereavement that follow a death that we ourselves might forget that there are other types of grief that we experience throughout life. And I was really excited when you said that you'd enjoy talking about that subject today.
Yeah, it's not only that there are other types of grief, but there are spin-offs of grief. And I was talking to someone the other day, I can't remember where, who had gone to a counselor because of grieving, and was complaining, that the counselor wasn't much help. I mean, I hear this all the time, and one of my big platforms is that when a counselor or a psychotherapist wants to work with grief, they absolutely have to go get specific training in grief, because it's not covered in your basic psychology degree. It's a whole separate special field. And I see a lot of counselors and people out there teaching and talking about things like, Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of dying and applying it to grief, which we know now isn't what it was intended for and doesn't work and doesn't apply, and, even her research has been questioned. So, but there are still people out there calling themselves grief experts and counselors who are using those 5 stages, and it's so inaccurate and outdated that whenever you hear somebody use that in terms of grief, you know that they haven't really been studying the current research in the last 30 years. So what I want to talk about today is some of that research and some of what we've learned about grief in the last 30 years, because it's very different than what the therapeutic community has thought of. So I'm going to just kind of jump into this whole thing, because if that's okay with you. So, everybody's heard the term grief work, and few people know that term was actually coined by Sigmund Freud. He wrote a paper in 1931 called Mourning and Melancholia, and he described his theory about how grief should be handled. And he said, you have to do this really hard work. You have to feel the pain, look at the pictures of the person who died, look at the old memories, and really go deep into it and really feel the pain, which was great. But the part that wasn't so great was, he said, the ultimate goal of this process, of this grief work, is to cut off your relationship with the person, to decrease the emotional attachment, to decrease the emotionality involved when you think about the person, to just shut it down. And for the next 40 years, that was considered standard procedure for grief counseling, and that's where we got language like moving on, letting go, getting over it. That was the standard. And then in the late 60s, early 70s, new theorists and researchers started coming onto the scene, and they came up with a whole new thing, which is what we in our spiritual community embrace, which is, they call it continuing bonds. That instead of cutting off the bond, you find ways to continue it in a different form. And we learn a lot of this from other cultures. So, for example, in China, when somebody dies, they build a little altar in their house to that person, and they put money on it and food and flowers, and they sort of keep the person in the family and gradually, I don't want to say detach, but gradually shift the relationship. They keep that altar up for a year. They can keep it forever if they want. And there are different ways. So what we have now is this completely new way, and it involves continuing bonds, and it involves tasks of grieving rather than stages. And so there's all of these theorists and teachers out there now who talk about the tasks of grieving, and everybody's got like a little chart. There's the 4 R's of grieving, there's the 6 steps, there's the 5 tasks, there's all this stuff, and it's all good. And one of the things that we've learned through all this is the different types of grief and the different things that we grieve for that seem subtle and are not always right up there on the surface where you can see them. There's one book that I came across recently that, if you're a professional in the grief counseling world or a chaplain in hospital or hospice, you might like this book. It's called All Our Losses, All Our Griefs by Kenneth Mitchell and Herbert Anderson. And they did something kind of cool. They came up with something they call 6 types of grief. And so I'm going to talk about that first, and then I'm going to add some of my own and some other things. And we can talk about each of these types. I'll just go through them one by one. Let's just go through them one by one. So the first type they call material grief. And that's because we have to remember, we're experiencing losses all the time. So a material loss can be your car breaks down and your car's in the shop for a few days. There's a grief there. There's a loss. On a bigger picture, it could be losing your home through a fire or foreclosure, a robbery in your house where your possessions are taken. Material loss can be bankruptcy, losing money, a stock market crash. Anything having to do with your relationship to the material world is a type of grief. And so when people are suffering, say, the loss of their house in a fire, it's helpful to know that this is not the same kind of grief you have with a death or an illness. This is a different kind of grief, and it has to be addressed a little bit differently, perhaps with different therapeutic processes or rituals having to do with attachment to material objects. So that's the material type. There's a relationship loss, which is pretty obvious to all of us, divorce or separation, estrangement from a family or friends. And this happens, all of these happen as secondary losses. So if we take a big loss like death, every one of these things, or most of them, are going to sort of spin off of that big loss. So a relationship loss, obviously, the person who died, that relationship has changed. Sometimes when somebody dies, especially if you have a child die, you will find that certain friends and family members pull away from you because it's so uncomfortable to be around you when you're grieving a horrible death like a child or death from violence. So you have that secondary loss of other relationships.
And I wanted to add to that, too, that sometimes I see families pull apart, especially after the death of a parent. It seems like sometimes the parent, as the head of the family, was the person holding everyone together, and that sometimes siblings can't find a way to keep the family structure together once the parents are gone. So it seems to me that just adds additional losses to the death of the parent, but losing the family structure, losing the connection to siblings as well.
Yes, and again, they're all interconnected. I'd love to sit down and make like a little flow chart of all these things to show how one thing triggers another. So in the case like you're talking about, if the patriarch of the family dies and that was the person who held the family together, you have the relationship loss. You could also have a financial loss. You find that you go to sell the house and you find that it's not worth what you thought it is, or all the objects, in the house you have to get rid of. So there's the siblings might fight over the will. So you have those kinds of losses too. And it also leads into the next kind of loss, which in this book, Mitchell and Anderson call it intrapsychic loss. I call it loss of self. So if somebody dies, for example, in a way that just your mind can't comprehend, like a kid in a school shooting, you lose your reality. You lose your sense of what is real in the world. You use your sense of self, like, I live in this nice community, I raised this nice kid, he goes to a nice school, and a guy comes in and shoots him. And so the assumptions of safety are lost, all this psychological and emotional stuff. And that can happen, again, from any other kind of loss of self, loss of sense of self. Another kind is a functional loss, so that's when if you get sick and your body is not functional anymore or injured, you can have a loss of cognition with Alzheimer's, something like that. So you never really think about all these different types, and I love that these two writers categorize them this way. So again, functional loss, your house burns down, you get injured, now you've got the material loss and the functional loss. Your reality is shattered, so you've got now the intrapsychic loss. See how they're all connected? It's pretty interesting. And then there's role, R-O-L-E, role loss. When your child dies, if it's your only child, you no longer have the role of a mother. When your husband dies, you no longer have the role of a wife. We also experience role loss if we lose a job, because we were the CEO, and now we're not a CEO anymore. Now we're unemployed. And I think a lot about what's going on in the White House right now with all these people leaving or getting fired. All those people are experiencing grief because that's a big job to lose, and they went through hell along the way. And so, Washington, D.C. is grieving just on that level, not to mention the larger level, which is sort of which leads us into the next one, which is called system loss. And a system loss is when a system fails you. So let's look at the government. And, what so many people in America are experiencing right now is, the government isn't functioning the way it's supposed to. We're having a loss of a system that we relied on. Another system loss can be your reliance on a church or a religious system, and when you have a crisis of faith and that system no longer makes sense to you, or a system loss in a corporation. So if you work for Wells Fargo and you find out one day that your bank has been doing all these corrupt things, or the stock market, any of those things. So we have a grief experience when a system fails us.
That's really interesting. I wanted to mention a couple of things. Well, going back to the role loss, for me personally, I experienced significant role loss when my youngest child went to college, and that empty nest syndrome. And it was really powerful grieving that I did as just suddenly the loss of a sense of that nuclear family under one roof together, me being the mother, coordinating everything, and suddenly having all of that just vanish from me. Even though, of course, I'm still a mom and my kids still need me, but just that life that we had built together in our house, that was a huge loss for me.
Yes. And that also includes relationship loss, because the relationship between you and your children is now different. And system loss, because your family system is now different.
Yes, so true. And then I wanted to mention, system loss. For me, as a medical professional, I've experienced some system loss when, I went through a certain amount of idealism in medical training, really believing in this profession that I was training for and all the science that I was learning. And gradually, as I've evolved and learned a lot more about healing and wellness, I would say that healthcare system I could no longer believe in anymore. And I've also seen it fail people over and over again, people who trusted in healthcare and trusted that somehow they would get better or the right answer would be found for them, and it wasn't there. Or sometimes their condition was worsened by the medical profession. So anyway, I can definitely apply that to my
that's
profession.
A great example. And you know what else happens in there too is retirement is role loss, relationship loss, system loss. It's all connected. It's really quite amazing. So you experienced retirement, empty nest, system loss with the medical. You had quite a big load put on you, and you probably never even thought that you were grieving those things.
Yeah, and interestingly, they all happened around the same time. There was a big transition all at the same time in my life, and so looking back, it makes sense to me why I was kind of in a state of confusion and conundrum for a while there, but it makes sense. So many losses all at once compounding one another.
And this is why, what my big teaching is ritual and ceremony to work with loss. So I once read years ago, before this was a popular thing, about when the kids grew up and moved away, somebody did a little ceremony of cutting the apron strings, and they actually took an apron and tied it on Mom and had the kid hold up the thing and cut it, and to symbolize that and to show that they're all in agreement and acceptance of this, which is kind of nice. And somebody else did something like that where they tied something around the mom and like a ribbon or a string or something, and another one around the kid, and together they cut it to say that, our role is not the same. You're going to be out in the world without me now. I'm not going to know where you are every minute of the day. I'm not going to be in charge of what you eat or what you wear, and I'm willing to let that go, says the mother. And then the kid says, as he's cutting it, all the same things, and, but I will always, call you and stay in touch with you and remember what you taught me. And you do this beautiful thing so that you just walk right into it and face it and work with it symbolically rather than just letting it happen and not even noticing it.
Yeah.
And then you're depressed and you don't know why.
That's interesting. As I think back on it, right after my youngest child left for college, my husband and I ended up selling our house and buying a new house in the same community. But that was almost a ritual in a way, because it was a step toward, we bought a smaller house, and it was a step toward, we're no longer a family of four under one roof. We're a new family, the two of us living together and starting a new life together. And so, but then of course we had the material loss of the house we left, but we went to a smaller, nicer house that was really fun for us. And so that, in a way, we did kind of approach that as a ritual, like we're starting over now, the two of us, because it really changed our relationship. Suddenly we weren't partners at being parents and raising two kids. We were suddenly, how we related to each other needed to change at the same time.
Yeah, well, that's why a lot of relationships run into problems after the kids leave, because for some relationships, the child is the conduit for the love. Instead of handing the love between the adults, you've got so many issues in your relationship that the love goes through the kid to the other person.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The kid's just kind of like the carrier of the love, because the marriage isn't healthy and the two people don't know how to give the love directly to each other.
Yeah.
And so then when the kid goes, you're sort of stuck with that, and you don't know how to love each other.
Yeah, stuck with it, and in the midst of grief and having to figure out, how do I rewrite my life story now, to move to the next phase. And
then the material loss is also, when you move to a new house, you don't have the child's bedroom anymore. I mean, that must be, I haven't gone through that. Well, I guess I did because my child died, but, breaking down that bedroom and redecorating and making it into a wine cellar or a guest room or whatever you do is also a huge loss that needs a serious ritual. So those are the main ones. Then these writers also added a couple of things that I like and I hadn't seen a lot of before. The difference between what they call avoidable and unavoidable loss. Now, these guys come from a kind of mainstream sort of Christian perspective, and I think from a different kind of perspective you would see this differently, because if you see the universe like I do, where everything happens for a reason, then nothing is avoidable or unavoidable. Everything is just happening in the natural kaleidoscope turning of life, and there are no accidents. But unavoidable, like a school shooting, is an avoidable loss. It did not have to happen. If people didn't have guns, nobody could go into a school and shoot kids. If a person dies of a drug overdose because they're a drug addict, that could be seen as an avoidable loss. It didn't have to be that way. But depending on one's spiritual and theological perspective, you would look at it a little bit differently. You would look at it like, well, that drug addict, that was his path that his soul chose, and it's a loss, but it was a chosen path, as all paths are. So that gets into a little kind of iffy philosophy stuff. What would an unavoidable loss be? I mean, I can't even see what that would be. A plane crash, cancer, it seems to me nothing could be avoidable or unavoidable. I haven't really figured out what I think about that one yet.
Yeah, I have some interesting thoughts about that too, because I feel like labeling a death as avoidable could be one of the things that just plunges us into guilt and grief, because with as you know, in my history, my father committed suicide, and so it was the pain of thinking of his death as avoidable and thinking, I should have done something, I could have done something, why didn't I do something? The guilt of that completely devastated me for years and years and years, until I reached a point of realizing more, as you were saying in your philosophy, that, you know what, maybe I could not have stopped him no matter what. Maybe this was his path, and he was so determined that there's nothing I could have done that would have prevented it. And that helped me find some sanity again, to be able to say, okay, no matter what, I just have to accept this is what happened. So whether it was avoidable or not, at this point, it doesn't matter. I can't carry that in my head, or it was destroying me and making me crazy.
That's a really, really good example. And, in some ways of thinking, people think that we can change another person or be responsible for another person. And in other ways of thinking, we don't think that. And I personally don't think that. I know a woman whose husband attempted suicide 11 times.
Wow. And
finally on the 11th time he succeeded. He jumped off the roof. And he did all kinds of stuff, and I don't know if it was every single time she found him or intervened, but somebody did. But clearly he was determined to exit.
Yes.
And you've got to respect a soul. And so this gets into a completely different topic, but, in our relationships, I always say in my workshops, there's only one problem that ever exists in any relationship, and it's that the other person won't do what you want them to do. And that includes staying alive versus dying.
It's true.
So another one they have here that I like is anticipated versus unanticipated. So unanticipated is obviously you send your kid to school in the morning and they get shot. And anticipated is like years of caregiving for a sick person. And it's different kind of grieving. And so I've done a lot of work with parents who've lost children, because I have a child who died myself. And we find ourselves often making a comparison, like a mother will say to me, I don't know how I could have gone through what you went through, watching your child deteriorate and die a little bit every day for years. I couldn't handle that. And I say to her, I couldn't handle having my kid go out to the store to buy milk and get killed in a car crash. And so we find ourselves making these comparisons between anticipated and unanticipated, and there really isn't any comparison. But it is a different feeling, and it is a different kind of grieving.
That definitely makes sense to me. And I was thinking about just this example of kids leaving home for college. That's definitely anticipated grief, because we know that, we assume we're raising our kids to leave us one day and go off
Hopefully.
and forge their own lives. Although I guess these days more and more kids are coming back home and living with their parents. But I remember anticipating my kids leaving for quite a few years before it really happened. But honestly, I didn't know how to prepare for it. I didn't know what that would feel like, or I couldn't even quite imagine, or what do I do about it. And I remember asking a woman who had kids a few years older than mine, who had already been through it. And I remember saying, what was it like for you? And she burst into tears just me asking her about it. And I thought, this is going to be hard.
My gosh.
She's telling me that it's a process that you have to go through for a while to adjust to it. So,
and there's lots of support for it. There's support groups. Now that we have the internet, you can find support and help for anything. And, people, the empty nest syndrome, that term didn't even exist until maybe 20 years ago. So now it's a recognized syndrome, and there's support for it. But it is a very different, a different kind of grief. It's not the same as somebody dies. It's not the same as somebody divorces you. It's just completely different. So there's also something they have here they call actual versus imagined loss. And to me, that touches on like PTSD. So somebody who's been seriously traumatized and is afraid to go into another relationship or afraid to fly on an airplane or whatever the trauma is operating under an imagined loss. That isn't, that the next relationship, we don't know if it's going to be terrible. The next time they get on an airplane, we don't know if they're going to crash like they did the first time, versus the actual event that happened that caused them to be traumatized. Also in a relationship, for example, where someone's been unfaithful one time or maybe more, and then you're spending the rest of the relationship worrying that that's going to happen again and what's going to happen to the marriage. So you're grieving an imagined loss that hasn't happened yet based on some past experience that you've had of having that loss and that you haven't been able to heal from. So those are the ones in this book that I'm finding so interesting. So here are the ones that I've added myself. And I came up with something today called Relinquishment Loss, which is something that you choose to give up. And I'll give you my own personal example. Both of my parents are living. My mom's 87. My father's 91. We have a very close relationship. Also, my sister. And some crap has happened in the family recently that has caused me to want to really pull away from them for a while. And I've kind of gone into this protective mode where I just need to not have a lot of contact with them right now. And I'm grieving, but it's a relinquishment. It's something that I have voluntarily chosen to relinquish. Nobody did it to me or for me. It was a choice I had to make for my own well-being, but still you grieve it. And relinquishment loss could be like kicking an addiction, quitting smoking. I mean, if you've ever been a smoker and quit, it's like your best friend has left you. And yet it's a healthy choice, and it's a choice that you made. So there's definitely a grieving that goes on when you choose to let go of something consciously. And again, it's treated a little bit differently. The bottom line on all of this is that these losses need to be honored with the right kinds of rituals to help you move through it.
It's interesting that you mentioned the quitting smoking, because I observed that with patients of mine who were trying to quit smoking and kept failing over and over again. And it finally occurred to me that what was missing was an acknowledgement of the grief, that it's okay for them to say, I loved smoking. It's okay, smoking's been so vilified that it's okay for them to say, just as you said, it was my best friend. I love it. I'm hurting to lose it, but I know I have to. And so that's such a good point that you make. If we once we address the fact that of course you feel pain and it hurts you to lose this habit that was pleasant for you and enjoyable, it seems like that's a missing piece for many people who try to quit smoking, that they're not acknowledging that grief component within it. Exactly. And that might make all the difference in their success at being able to successfully relinquish the habit they're trying to give up.
That is such a good point, Karen. And think about the way we respond to people who quit smoking. They say, I quit smoking, and you go, yay for you, congratulations. What if we said, I'm really happy that you quit smoking, and I know it probably kind of feels bad at the same time. I mean, what if we knew the right things to say to acknowledge that grief? And I imagine that addiction counselors probably know this, to say, okay, you're going to quit drinking. it's like losing your best friend. And let's do a little grief meditation or a little grief ceremony to say goodbye to this best friend as if somebody died. And, you could even dig a little grave and put your pack of cigarettes in there and say a little ceremony to make a ritual out of it so that you recognize the grief. That's a great idea. Thank you for mentioning that. I'm going to put that in here. Because I'm taking notes of this because this is all going to go into my dissertation. So this is good. So here's another one that I really like is tribal or national grief. And this is like losing your culture. So think about Hawaiians or Native Americans or any group that's been colonized, that's had their culture taken away from them, and in that there have been deaths, loss, there's material loss, loss of land, there's role and identity loss because we're not in control. Let's just look at the Native Americans. It's the best example. We don't have our culture anymore. We're not in charge of this land. We can't do things the way that we've always done it. Lost culture, lost language, and that's also a system loss. So I call it tribal loss, but again, there should be like very powerful healing ceremonies to work with that. And I think that America is going through that right now. It's a system loss with our government being such a mess. And, culture's changing. We're grieving having a government that we can have faith in. I don't want to be too political here, but I think you know what I'm talking about. Yes. And then there's vicarious or secondary loss. So vicarious is suffering over other people's losses. So again, let's use school shooting as an example. We're all in deep, deep pain about this. I've cried a lot since this shooting in Florida. It just hurts my heart and it makes me cry. And it touches on everything else. It touches on avoidable, unavoidable. It touches on system failing, loss of self, loss of belief in what you know to be true. It's material loss. So I didn't make this up, but in the grief community, it's called vicarious loss, experiencing what other people are feeling through their loss. I didn't have a kid killed in that school, but I feel deep, deep pain over it. I can't turn away from it. So I'm grieving too. The whole country is grieving together. And then there's collective grief, which is in many cultures, and I think we may have talked about this before. Did we ever talk about Sobonfu Some? Do you know who she is?
Oh, yes, I think we did. I remember the name at least.
Yeah, so she was this African woman who traveled all over the world teaching the grief ceremony from her village. And she recently died, and that's a whole other interesting story, but she would teach that in her village, when somebody dies, it's not just the one family that's grieving and people come over and bring food and help with the housekeeping. The whole village grieves together, and they have a ceremony for 3 days with drumming and singing and crying and dancing and ritual, collective community grief. So when you see something very public like a school shooting, and especially this last one in Florida where these amazing kids are coming out on the news and starting a movement, but you also see it like when you drive down the street and you see a place where someone's died in a car crash and the community brings flowers and puts a little cross up. I mean, we don't have enough of that. And that's a different form of grieving when something happens to your community and it's not just a personal loss of your own, where you start to step into a bigger, more inclusive picture of loss and you share it together.
And I feel like we need so much more acknowledgement of that collective loss, because sometimes I feel like we may tend to shut out those those losses that don't affect us personally, we may tend to shut those out of our awareness and not become a participant in that collective experience of loss. But it's so rich and it's powerful if we can feel our own pain, as you said, when a school shooting happens, or when a tragedy strikes one family in the community. If we can feel our own pain and share that, I feel like that just strengthens our bonds with other people, and it really makes us more human if we have the courage to go ahead and participate in the pain and join into that collective grief.
And to speak it out loudly. I mean, this is I'm doing this wonderful thing next month in San Francisco. I got invited to do this. It's sort of a learning circle. It's at a place, it's sort of a homeless shelter, but not really. It's kind of a permanent living facility for people who were homeless, and they come from all different cultures, and they speak many different languages, Russian, Mandarin, I can't remember exactly, a bunch of them. And so I'm facilitating a round table there where I'm going to ask them to talk about their traditional handling of grief in their culture. Maybe not in their culture now, but how it was in their parents' generation or their grandparents' generation. And it's going to be this great discussion with translators, translating for everybody. So I'm just so excited about doing this because I want to learn what they do. And they had originally asked me to come and be a speaker about death and grief practices. And when I found out they had all these people from different cultures, I said, I don't want to be the speaker. I want to be the listener. I want to learn from them. But one of the things that you'll find in many other cultures is this collective grieving process that we don't have here. So what we have here when somebody dies is a funeral, and that lasts a couple hours, and then for the next week or two, the people come to your house and bring you food and take care of your dog and do whatever you need. But after 2 or 3 weeks, that's all gone, and you're left all alone to grieve with your spouse or whoever you've got left. And it's another loss. It's like, whoa, where are all these people who loved me, who were taking care of me a minute ago?
Yeah.
So now you've got that loss on top of the first one. And, what they say in grief, support is if somebody's spouse or child dies, it's great to be with them early on, but it's even more important to check in with them 3 months later, 6 months later, 9 months later, because that's when they've been forgotten, and that's when daily life is actually harder. The first few weeks are the easiest in some ways, because you're held up by so many people and so much attention. Then that all goes away. Well, in many other cultures, that doesn't ever go away. You're always part of the community. And, I think that's one of the great gifts that we're receiving from what happened with this last school shooting, is that it's going to make a change. These kids are creating community in a way we've never seen before after one of these shootings. We have to learn from this.
Yeah, that's so true. They're stepping up as the leaders we really needed in a way to galvanize us in a way into this collective grief process. And it's amazing how we're seeing it in communities all over the country, people coming together and expressing their own pain and their emotion about
and very
issue.
Publicly, the media is kind of amazing, that this is all being covered so well. And, I give Elisabeth Kubler-Ross a huge amount of credit because she brought death into the national conversation. No one was talking about it before her book on death and dying. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah. And so, kudos to her for that. Even though her research wasn't that great, she contributed so much, and that door has been opened, and it will never be able to be closed again. And now, since her time, we have the Internet, and mass media like we've never had before. And we can't hide from any of this anymore. We can't hide from death, violence, grief. It's all so exposed that we can't help but learn how to process things differently. That plus we're exposed to other cultures in a way we've never been before, thanks to mass media. So now we learn about what Muslims do, what Buddhists do, what they do in China, what they do in South America for their grief. All of this information is at our fingertips. What a wonderful time to be alive.
Yes, it's so true. And to be in the midst of this growing movement and to be able to watch things change before our eyes almost on a daily basis, it's really incredible.
Yeah. So, I'm so grateful to be working in this field and to be in school right now where I'm learning so much. I'm sure that's what I came here to do. Apparently.
Yes.
It was unavoidable.
Well, I'm glad for that, because I'm glad that you're not only learning, but you're sharing with others and teaching others what you're learning in the process. So we're all benefiting from the hard work you're doing in school right now. So thank you.
You're all going to school with me. Several years ago I realized that my speaking career is based on my education, because basically like every year or so what I speak about, teach about, not every year, it changes all the time, but basically if I speak at a place, I used to speak at this place in Oregon called the Spiritual Awareness Community, and like once a year I would speak there and I would say, well, let me tell you what I learned in school this year. Basically, it all just goes into my presentations, and I realize that that's what I'm doing, is I'm just kind of coming out and saying, all right, well, I just spent the last 6 months studying trauma, and here's what I learned, and here's how I incorporate it with, my understanding of the afterlife and multicultural stuff. So I'm just giving everybody an education. I don't see myself as a self-help person. I see myself as a teacher.
Which is perfect. You're a teacher who's also a student, and that, I think, is the perfect role to play. You're constantly learning what you need to learn so that you can teach others, and all of us should have that same, I'm always a student, always learning, but I also want to be teaching anyone I can about what I've learned. So I think that's perfect.
Yeah, I love that idea.
Well, Terri, as we're close to running out of time, and I wanted to take a minute to talk about what you have, what's coming up for you. I know that you've been doing grief workshops around the country, and do you have anything else scheduled in the near future?
Oh, yes. I have something wonderful scheduled, and I know that a lot of your listeners are professionals, and I am now able to give CEUs for one of my workshops, which I have arranged through my seminary. So May 1st through 4th in Northern California, I'm doing a weekend retreat with Austin Wells. She's co-facilitating with me, and it's Grief as a Mystical Journey, and it's going to be 2.5 days of interactive exercises, guided meditations, ceremony and ritual, family dynamic mapping, conscious dying processes. It's going to be absolutely amazing. And we have CEUs for social workers. We have for RNs, EMTs, all kinds of wonderful CEUs. So if any of you need that continuing education, please come to this workshop. Go to the website spiritualityandgrief.com, and you will find the information there. So there's that in May.
That sounds amazing. So what are the dates in May again?
That is May 1 through 4.
Okay.
And that's, oh no, I'm wrong about that. Oops, correction. It's May 4 through 6. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm confusing it with the Afterlife Conference. And then, of course, there's the Afterlife Conference, and that's going to be in Orlando, and that is November 1 through 4.
Okay.
That's what I was thinking of. and that's our 8th annual conference. We've made it 8 years, and I hope we make it 8 more. And we have wonderful teachers, not just about death and grief, but also about, we have religious scholars, we have shamans, healers, academics. We have Andrew Harvey this year, which is kind of a big deal. He's
he's amazing.
He's a world-famous, wonderful mystic and scholar. And so that's going to be incredible. And you go to afterlifeconference.com for that. And, of course, Karen, you've been to the conference many times.
Yes.
And I also want to invite you publicly on the radio to come in 2019 when I believe we're going to be in Salt Lake City.
Oh.
So that'll be pretty easy for you to get to.
That's nice to hear. Well, and I wanted to say it's not too early to register for that November conference in Orlando, right? People could sign up now.
Definitely not. Yeah, it's time to register. The time is here. So I hope a lot of people will go there. And if you go to the website, afterlifeconference.com, there's a link that you can click to subscribe. And if you subscribe, you'll get our newsletter, which is called the Afterlife Advocate. And that way you'll stay informed of all these workshops and all the stuff that's coming up.
That's really wonderful. And having co-facilitated a grief workshop with you at last year's Afterlife Conference, I can say it would be so worth it for people to join in to that the workshop you're doing in Northern California in May. It's so worthwhile and really powerful. So
especially with the CEUs. I mean, that's that's such a great thing. And, let's do that again at the 2019 conference, Karen. That thing that we did, it was called Spiritual Self-Care for Death Care Professionals. Yes. And it was just, really great stuff about how do you take care of yourself if you're around death all the time. And do you remember we had that woman in there who was a pediatric nurse, pediatric ICU?
Yes.
Oh, God. And she was just carrying all these deaths of all these babies with her from her years in that career and was able to process that using the little therapeutic processes and symbolic rituals that we came up. I'll never forget her. She's probably listening right now.
It was beautiful. it was so powerful, and I just it's just so important that we do take care of ourselves in this way, and we may not have access to the kind of group sharing that happens in these workshops, and then the rituals that we can create together, and it's something very unique and very special.
Yeah, professionals don't have that. I think I talked about during that workshop my nephew who just finished his residency in ER, and at his hospital they had a chaplain who was very spiritual and shamanic, and she had I guess doctors have like a locker room or something. I've never been that far backstage in a hospital before, but I guess they have some sort of locker room, and in that locker room where they change their clothes or whatever, she had put a bowl of stones and crystals so that the doctors either after or before their shifts could carry these stones with them to absorb the energy of pain and loss and trauma and everything that they had worked with during the day. And she actually taught them how to use these stones, carry it in your pocket as you go through the day, and at the end of the day when you go home, take the stone out of your pocket, put it in salt water to absorb the energy, take the water out, pour it into your garden or something, and do this every day or every week so that the energy is not stuck inside your body, that you're holding it after all the traumatic stuff that you've seen all day.
Wow.
Little ceremonies like that make a huge difference.
I love that. That's really beautiful.
Yeah, it's pretty nice to have that in a hospital.
Yeah, definitely. And we need that everywhere. That kind of
everywhere.
Well, Terri, thank you so much for talking to me today. This has been really fun and fascinating. I always love sharing time with you. So just thanks for sharing what you're learning now.
Thank you, Karen. I always love spending time with you, too. You're one of my favorite peeps.
Thank you so much. Well, to all of our listeners, remember that it's spiritualityandgrief.com for the conference in Northern California, and then afterlifeconference.com. Is that correct, Terri?
The Afterlife Conference in Florida, yep.
And then can people also just go to your website, Daniel Direct?
They can. It's not quite as direct when you go to that website. I have so many of them, and that one's just kind of my catch-all website. You can certainly go there if you want to, learn about me and what I do, but I prefer to send people to the ones that are more specifically for these events, so you don't have to wade through too much stuff to get there.
All right.
But danieldirect.net is my, general website.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Terri, and I'm looking forward to the next time you and I get together. Hopefully it won't be
it may not be until
long.
The 2019 Afterlife Conference, but you never know when I'll be in Colorado. It happens.
Yeah, you never know. So, yep, I look forward to seeing you again. And thanks to everyone listening, too. I hope you enjoyed our conversation today. So,
thank you, everybody. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks, Terri, and goodbye.
Bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview with Terri Daniel. And I wanted to just bring up some of the highlights that stood out for me. One was Terri mentioned continuing bonds grief theory, which is a newer grief theory that has kind of replaced Sigmund Freud's older theories about grief. And I think that's a really fascinating area that I'd love to do some more conversations about continuing bonds, which basically describes that our passage through grief helps us maintain a sense of connection with our loved ones who have died, rather than being the process of trying to forget our loved ones who have died and trying to erase the fact that they existed in the past. And then we talked about additional types of grief that we experience through life, and I'll just give you a list of those. Material loss, like losing our material possessions; relationship loss; intrapsychic loss, which is kind of our loss of a sense of self; functional loss due to illness; role loss, when our roles in life change and we no longer play the same parts we used to play in life; system loss, when a system we are part of fails us. And then Terri also mentioned relinquishment loss, tribal and national loss, and vicarious loss. She mentioned that there are some distinctions between actual and imagined loss, and possibly between avoidable and unavoidable loss. So we had a little conversation about that and decided that dichotomy may not be helpful and may not even be very accurate. So that's kind of an interesting topic to consider. And then also the importance of ritual and ceremony to help us heal loss, and how many times rituals and ceremonies just don't exist in our society for the types of losses that we experience. So I thought that was a really fun conversation to kind of expand our idea of grief, but also to be aware that when a death occurs, we are often experiencing many of the other types of grief while we're also grieving the death of a loved one. And so we actually have cumulative grief because we're dealing the loss of many other aspects of our life as we are going through the grief over a death. And so it's important for us to be aware of that, and that sometimes even in the death of a loved one that has been anticipated and perhaps an elderly loved one who's been sick for a long time, and a death that in some ways may feel peaceful or we may describe as a blessing for that person, we're also experiencing additional types of grief while we're going through that death. And so it might be why sometimes I hear people express like, I don't know why I feel so overwhelmed by this grief, because actually, I felt relieved for my father that finally his suffering and this ongoing illness and process he was going through had come to an end, and yet I just feel overwhelmed with loss. It's because not only the loss of the loved one, but the other accompanying losses that happen at that same time. So I think that's something really important for us to acknowledge and be aware of. So thanks again for tuning in today. Glad you've been here for another episode of End of Life University podcast. And remember, there will be a new one next week, every Monday, a new episode for you to listen to. I appreciate all of your support. And until the next time we're together, remember to face your fear, be ready for whatever life brings your way, and love your life. Love every moment of it. Until we're together next time, goodbye.